Alright guys, we are back with another tier list. I'm so excited for this. We're finally doing one just because it's been so many months of nothing but Snake Eye, Fire King, basically Snake Eye being the best deck, so I haven't actually made one to update, but we've had so many new decks that have dropped. The meta's definitely mixed up now. We have a new deck that is a top contender. It's Yubel. But before we get into that, would you like to make your Master Duel experience a whole lot better?
Are you ready to take your Yu-Gi-Oh! Master Duel play experience to a new level? The Untapped GG Companion is here for you. Use the deck tracker to know exactly what cards you have in your deck, and to go over any cards you aren't familiar with yet by hovering over them. It instantly updates when you draw a card, and automatically hides if you check your extra deck or graveyard. This is the perfect tool to help you master a new deck. The Untapped GG Companion also lets you import decks directly into the game in seconds. Copy any YDK or YDKE deck string, create a new deck in-game, click the Start Auto Import button, and let us take the wheel. Once the duel is over, check your win rate on your personal stats page. Brag among your friends and share your decks so they can import them into the game too. Start your path to master today by downloading the Untapped GG Companion at ygom.untapped.gg.
Alright, so here we are. We have the tier list. So right off the bat, we have Yubel. Yubel, without a doubt, is tier 1. Whether it's better than Fire King, Snake Eye, or not is definitely up for debate. It's definitely the most used deck right now, so if you get into the ladder, no matter where you are, it's going to be the most used deck. It has pretty strong end boards. It's a very difficult deck to deal with if you don't have a ton of removal, because you have to get rid of the Nightmare card, the Nightmare Pain, you have to get rid of, then all of the monsters float, all of that kind of stuff. Both decks are very, very strong. I'd say Yubel does have some bad matchups, also against like general stuff like Burn or something like that. It might be a little rough. Where I'd say the weakness of this deck is probably that it's a little more normal summon reliant than Snake Eye Fire King, and it has a worse follow-up than Snake Eye Fire King, but this does have, in a lot of ways, better end boards than Snake Eye Fire King. It's debatable which one's better, but I'd say probably I'd give, and I'll put it now, I think Snake Eye Fire King is slightly better than the Yubel deck right now. These are the two best decks in the game, no doubt about it. By far, the two best decks in the game. By, I would say, like almost a mile. These are the best decks. If you're picking up anything, it's these two. The other thing you got to remember is that Snake Eye Fire King did get hit. They do have Bonfire, I think, at 2. They have the Ash, which is their one card everything combo at 1. So, you know, they do have a few hits, whereas Yubel is completely free on the ban list. But like I said, Yubel is very normal summon reliant. Fire King is also a very good engine to mix Snake Eyes with, Snake Eyes with, just because it just raises the ceiling of the deck that much more. Yubel, like I said, very normal summon reliant. If you sometimes just imperm like the Dark Beckoning Beast, it can, in a lot of situations, just kind of end their turn, which you can't really do that with Snake Eye because they have a lot more extenders. So I would say just slightly better Snake Eye Fire King, but I can understand why most people are playing Yubel now. This deck has been meta relevant for like 6 months, and it's probably going to be relevant for 3-4 more months. I don't know how long until they decide to hit it, and Yubel is probably going to remain unhit for a while now. But generally, Yubel is a very difficult deck to play against. If you have a Rogue deck, has a fantastic Rogue matchup. Because they don't have as much removal, so it becomes very difficult because you have to remove several layers of cards to finally be able to attack and get something going. So I'd say it's probably like a tier 1 deck. Next is Centurion. Centurion is easily a tier 2 deck. It's probably one of the best synchro decks in the entire game right now, if not the best synchro deck in the entire game right now. Just as a synchro engine, it's very, very good. Again, it's one of those things where it's new, so it's getting more representation, but generally speaking, it is a very strong deck, because there's other new decks that have come out that aren't getting representation, and this one is. And there's a reason for that. It is actually a very strong synchro deck. It's a lot more consistent than a lot of the others, stuff like Synchron. It's a lot more consistent than things like Synchron. It may not have as good of an end board as Synchron, but generally speaking, getting into your combos is a whole lot easier. It's more resilient. The field spell's really good. It lets you synchro summon. So you have a lot of ways to like cheat things out. I'd say tier 2 is more than fair for this deck. This is Shinobird. This is the first time I've added Shinobird on here. Shinobird is a rogue deck, and I think it's a very interesting deck. Like, in terms of card design, it's probably one of the most interesting decks that you'll ever find. It is a spirit deck that is also a ritual deck. It is incredibly interesting to play. It's been a going second deck for a very, very long time, but recently I would argue it's become a little more versatile because the new support actually allows you to go first, and then you can ritual summon on your opponent's turn, and then you can non-targeting either shuffle 3 spells or traps into the deck, or shuffle 3 monsters into the hand, and then summon like Imato Iwado onto the board. So overall, it's a very interesting rogue deck, definitely very fun to play, but it can be a little, because it's a ritual deck, so you have the key issues of a ritual deck, which is you have to sink a lot of resources into what you're trying to do, and then there's the key issues of it just being a spirit deck where all of your monsters get bounced at the end phase. So you have two mechanics that are very, very underwhelming, and then on top of that you fuse them together, and then on top of that it's now you have to, even though if the effects are broken, they're just two summoning mechanics that are maybe not quite as good as modern summoning mechanics, like Link 1 monsters, for example, or being able to contact fusion your entire opponent's board with Yubel. Like it's or you can just cheat out synchro monsters with Centurion with the Crimson Dragon. Like, this deck doesn't really cheat anything out, and in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, the way they've designed it, if you're not cheating a mechanic out, you're not competing. And it really is kind of, it sucks that they've done this, where, you know, that you have to essentially cheat a mechanic in order to be a competent deck. You can't even play it the way it's supposed to be anymore. Next is Magispector. Magispector, I'd say it's arguable. You could put it in Rogue, you could put it in Tier 3. It's a good deck. I'd say it's probably at the top of Rogue. It's a deck that can search out, first of all the monsters can't be targeted or destroyed by card effects, just base. Like, just the regular old monsters, they all can't be targeted, can't be destroyed, which is very good for the archetype, because it makes it very difficult to interact with them. Especially, like, you can't imperm anything, you can't, like, target, remove anything. They can't be destroyed by card effects or by... Yeah, they can be destroyed by card effects or targeted, so they can't even, like, be Raigeki'd or anything. It like, randomly does come up where a lot of opponents won't know, and you just lose that way. The other thing is... they can actually search, like, Secret Village with the new support. This is one of those decks that is very, very good going first. Going second, it's a little more fragile, and it is a little difficult when... like, this is one of those decks where, had these two not been released, I would argue this is here, maybe here. You can make different arguments as to where this deck is. The meta would be so much interesting if these two didn't exist, I'll be honest with you, because then we'd have, like, so many decks up here, and some of these rogue decks would be moved up. But against Snake Eye Fire King, if you go second with this deck, it is like a death sentence. Same thing with Yubel. So I'd say Rogue for now. Watts is interesting. I usually would consider building something else, because it's a very underwhelming deck. It did get new support, so there are combos that you can do where you can OTK your opponent fairly easily, because you have multiple direct attackers. There is like a 1.5 card combo that can do it. But the problem is you have to go second, because the whole point of the deck is that you go second and you attack directly, and you can, like I said, OTK your opponent. The problem is, if they have any form of interruption, none of that is happening. So generally speaking, Watts is an underwhelming deck. It's kind of like Tunes, but you actually get to attack the turn you summon the monsters. So I would say I would put it in Rogue, but I honestly think this is like a deck you play for fun in Silver. I don't think that this is like a deck that you can do a lot with. Like I said, you definitely can steal games with it, but I wouldn't say it's like a consistent strategy. You can play it in Gold, you can play it in Platinum, but I think when you get to like Diamond stuff, it just becomes very difficult to actually accomplish anything. Yeah, I wouldn't say avoid at all costs, because it's better than most of the decks in there. But consider building something else. Just generally, I'd say consider building something else. It's not even Rogue, and it's very inconsistent. And if you go first, you do literally nothing. If you go first, it just accomplishes nothing. Next is Element Sabers. I'm going to stop sugarcoating things. This deck is straight up ass. It is one of the worst decks ever made. I swear to you, I think you can beat it with a starter deck Kaiba. I'm not even joking with you. I think you really can. It requires so much setup, and the payoff is horrific. The best card in the archetype is the Field Spell, and the Field Spell stops you from attacking the next battle phase. So even if you can accumulate a lot of advantage, sometimes you can't even finish your opponent off, because you're like skipping your own battle phases. The big drawback of this deck is skipping your battle phase, but there's no payoff. You're just skipping battle phases. It's not like Runic. Runic skips your battle phase, but you get to do all this crazy stuff. You get to, like, draw 3 cards. You get to pop your opponent's cards. You get to mill their deck, and the payoff is you get the instant fusion quick effect out of your extra deck whenever you want to, and then they all float. Like, that's the payoff for Runic. This has the same This has the same drawback with none of the payoff, because it's not like Runic, right? You're not milling your opponent's deck. You actually have to attack them. That's the deck. It's not like you can burn them. You can't mill their deck. You have to attack them, but you're skipping battle phases. Who designed that and why'd they do that? It's not a broken archetype in any way. It just skips your opponent's, like, your battle phase for no reason. I guess they did that to mimic all of the other element sabers, like the big elemental lords, but that's just a dumb restriction on the best card in the archetype. And even if that restriction wasn't there, the deck would still not be good enough, because it's just not. It's like a deck that should have been released in 2005. Honestly, it's just not a very good card or a deck. Next is Memento. I'd say Memento's like a rogue deck. This is another deck that is like interesting. I actually really like the artwork's awesome. A lot of people really like this deck in terms of the artwork, because they took a bunch of vanilla monsters and like threw them on and made them into effect monsters. It is a cool concept for a deck. They do fusion summon, and they do have good in-archetype big boss monsters. They can definitely play through hand traps, which is also really cool about the deck. I would say the main issue with this is the main issue with a lot of rogue decks. It can't compete with like tier 1 stuff. There's nothing broken about it. It's a very like classically built Yu-Gi-Oh deck. You actually have an in-archetype fusion spell. You actually do have to fusion summon. You can't like cheat things out. You can't like super poly your opponent's board or something like that. Like, it is a very classically built Yu-Gi-Oh deck. It has a Stratos, which is this witch card. Like, it has it's like a deck built in like 2018, which is tough to compete with decks built in 2024. That's kind of the issue with this deck. Chimera's good. Chimera, I'd say, is probably tier 3. I put Chimera. It's a very strong deck. It's probably one of the best fusion decks in the game right now. I would say Branded is slightly above it, but this deck is good because I'd say the ceiling is higher on this deck, but I'd say it's a little less consistent because you actually have to like fusion summon. Whereas with Branded, you can kind of cheat things out a little bit more. I'd say the ceiling is maybe a little higher on this deck, but this deck is going to get even more support. The cool thing about this deck is it's Illusion Chimera, so any new Illusion support that comes out will inevitably kind of support this, which is kind of cool. And yeah, I'd say it's probably somewhere around tier 3. This is Evolzars. I don't think you should play them pure. Evolzars is just a terrible deck. They have trouble summoning their own boss monsters. Like, this is Lars. They have trouble summoning them. I would say consider building something else is probably like Evolite, Evolzars, all of those. They're very difficult to summon in their own archetype. I'd say you just play it in Dinosaurs and play a dinosaur pile, and that's going to be the answer for a lot of things, but I think this is consider building something else. I'd say this is tier 3, but this is more of an engine than a deck. This is Horus. You can play it pure. I've seen Horus stun on the ladder a lot. Like, a lot of people like Horus stun. Horus is a very like newbie engine because you basically just get to summon 4 level 8 monsters every single turn, which if you're a noob, that's pretty exciting, right? It's like summoning 4 blue eyes white dragons every single turn. They can't be destroyed by card effects unless it targets. They also can send something at the start of the battle phase. That's cool. And then if anything leaves, they trigger a bunch of other effects. So that's the core concept of the deck. But generally speaking, it's used as an engine for other things. So you'll play it in like maybe Galaxy Eyes or Blue Eyes, or a deck that basically summons rank 8 monsters. And you can summon a lot of monsters, and you can play in stuff like Tearlaments and stuff like that just to get things into the graveyard, because Gold Sarcophagus can put a bunch of things in the graveyard. What else is cool is that they put all of the support all in essentially one pack, so it's all in the game automatically, and that's really cool. So I'd say tier 3 as an engine. It's kind of debatable. You can put it in Rogue, you put it in tier 3. It depends on how you play the deck. If you play pure with stun, it's actually pretty good. With like there can only be one and skill drain, like that deck's pretty difficult to beat because every monster's 3,000. You're under skill drain, you're under the power stone. It can be very good. It's just a very good like anti-meta deck if it's played pure, probably like tier 3. Next is Volcanic. I'd say this is probably at the top of Rogue. This is a deck that I've actually been using recently in the ladder, and it's gotten me actually quite high, which is really nice. It's a deck that can FTK if your opponent essentially doesn't draw a hand trap, but you can play a lot of times through hand traps. But it's very easy to FTK. Their new boss monster, Volcanic Emperor, is like really, really good. He burns for 500 every single time they summon, but he also is a part of the FTK. On top of that, this deck actually has a really good Yubel matchup because Yubel it ends on a board that continues to float and float and float, but this deck just burns. So like the Yubel matchup is legitimately like almost an auto win whether you go first or second, because you're not attacking, you're summoning things in defense. You're not going to attack them, and you just burn and burn and burn and burn. Every time they summon, you burn. It's actually a fantastic matchup with Yubel, which is very tough to say against most Rogue decks on this tier list. But I'd say it's probably at the top of Rogue. Great matchup with this, but at the same time, it has bad matchups. Like Snake Eye is kind of a rough matchup because it's very resilient. Next is Valmonica. I'd say Valmonica is definitely like a Rogue deck. It's missing a little bit something. I actually like the playstyle of this deck. It is basically pendulums, and they place counters onto the pendulums, and then you can, when you have a certain amount of counters, you can summon certain monsters from your extra deck, and if you have certain counters, those extra deck monsters get additional effects, like they can attack twice in the battle phase, they gain a bunch of attack. It's a cool concept, but I would say the deck is definitely quite fragile and has trouble playing through established boards, like a lot of trouble playing through established boards. I just think generally it's kind of underwhelming. It's definitely not consider building something else. It's better than that. But I'd say just generally the deck is a little bit underwhelming, can have trouble dealing with established boards. Next is, this is the XYZ package. This is like that fish, the water warrior package that came out. The XYZ armor package. I think it's a package. I wouldn't play it pure. I don't think that you really can play it pure. It's a bunch of extra deck monsters and spells and traps. I don't see how you could play that pure, but it's great in Sharks. It's great in a bunch of different archetypes that basically use rank 3s and rank 4s. It's even better in decks that can use rank 3s, but it's still good in decks that can use rank 4s. You can steal your opponent's monster. You can do a bunch of other things. It basically raises the ceiling of a rank 3 or a rank 4 deck. It's actually quite cool, so I'd say avoid at all costs as a pure deck because it's physically impossible to do, but I would say there's a lot of decks that can benefit from playing it by mixing it in, like Zodiacs, for example. Next is Resonators. Resonators is kind of a good deck. I'd say it's probably in tier 3. It's probably in tier 3. Has very resilient, can play through a lot of combos. I'd say at this point it's actually better than Synchrons because it's less fragile than Synchrons. Yeah, it's a good deck. I'd say, again, it's just kind of, if you eliminate these two, the game becomes very interesting. But with these two in it, these two are just so much better than everybody else that, you know, it's like Fire King will almost always beat this deck because they have a bunch of one-card starters. Whereas with this deck is more of like a classic Synchro deck. You're not cheating things out. You actually are Synchro summoning. So you have to have like 2 monsters, for example. Then you Synchro summon, you get to Ride Rising, and then you kind of like climb and climb and climb. Every combo is usually going to be like a 2-card combo, 3-card combo, 1.5-card combo. There's no like 1-card full board kind of fill the graveyard situation with this deck. So it kind of, because it's more of a classic deck, it is a little lower. Next is Tistina. This deck is like middle of Rogue. It's kind of a disaster of a deck. Everything kind of like does something different. I don't know how they designed this deck, what they were thinking. It can pop off, I'm not going to lie. Like you can sometimes just lose against it because the boss monster is just very good. But outside of the boss monster, like the deck kind of just does things that are just all over the place. So I'd say it's probably somewhere in Rogue. Unchained, I'd say, is probably like a pure Unchained. It's probably like tier 3, probably above these two. It is played very much in a lot of Fiend strategies right now. I'd say tier 3 is probably like a fair place to put it. I think it's a very good deck. It hasn't been hit at all. It's still a very strong deck. Again, it's one of those decks. It would be better if these two didn't exist, but as of right now, I think it's a very strong deck. Very resilient through hand traps. It used to be a deck. It's crazy to say this. This used to be a deck that would literally lose to singular Ash Blossom. I'm not even kidding you. If you ask an Unchained player like from 2-3 years ago, Ash Blossom was like the Achilles heel of this deck. You would lose every single duel. One Ash Blossom would end the duel. Like, you'd activate the trap card, then you'd get ashed, you'd lose. Now the deck has so many resilient, like so resilient against hand traps. I'd say maybe the problem with it is that it is a little underwhelming on its end board. But in terms of playing through hand traps, it's phenomenal. It's a very strong deck, and it's very represented in like Yubel, for example. You can play it in Labyrinth, you can play it in Yubel, you can play it in a lot of different like Fiend decks. Very good for that reason. I'd say probably tier 3 is a pure deck. Pure Snake Eye, I'd say Fire King Snake Eye is the best. I'd say pure Snake Eye is tier 3, tier 2. I'd say maybe tier 2. It is still very good, but I think with the Snake Eye Ash getting hit to 1, it makes it a little less consistent, because obviously if they stop that Snake Eye Ash, or if they like banish it or something like that, it can make your follow-up very, very terrible. So I'd say probably like around tier 2, maybe tier 3, somewhere around there. I'd say tier 2 is probably fair. Battling Boxer, unique strategy, has some good cards. I'd say it's probably in Rogue, bottom of Rogue, somewhere around there. It has very good main deck monsters, but I think the extra deck monsters are what's a little bit lacking in the deck. It's very good at spamming monsters, but it's very bad at doing something with the monsters that you actually spammed onto the board. Like I said, they really could have used some new extra deck monsters, not just main deck monsters. New main deck monsters are actually very good. I'd say, yeah, the extra deck monsters are the things that are a little bit lacking. TGs are super underwhelming. I'd say it's Rogue. This is another deck where it locks you into TGs at one point in your combo, and I've seen people play it with Snake Eye, but I don't think it's actually worth it. It's the deck itself, because you can use like Salamandra, which is a level 1 fire, so you can mix it with Snake Eye, and you can summon it with the Sinful Spoils card, for example, off of the Diabellstar Witch. So it's actually not bad. This deck, the problem with it is the main deck is great, but the extra deck is so underwhelming. Like the boss monsters for TGs will be like, it'll be like a level 11 monster that, it'll be like a level 11 monster that requires a tuner synchro plus 2 more monsters, and it's level 11, and its effect will be like, if a spell or trap card targets this card, you can negate it. Like it's insane how much you have to sink into a monster that's so underwhelming. It really is. The extra deck for this is what's really lacking. I think if this deck got a better extra deck, because it does lock itself into TGs, if this deck got itself a better extra deck, like a really good, like a, I would say, who's like a really good extra deck up here, like a Chimera extra deck, or like a Resonator extra deck, I think this deck could easily be somewhere up here. But as of right now, because the extra deck is so underwhelming, I'd say it's probably somewhere around a Rogue deck. Paleozoic is, honestly, I think this deck is really slept on, because I don't think a lot of people even want to play it, but I think it's a tier 3 deck. This deck takes forever to play, because it is very good, because you can use Grasslook Screener, build a 60 card deck. Transaction rollback is insane in this deck. The only drawback to this deck, I would argue, in trying to play it on the ladder, is that it takes forever to play. I'm not even joking with you. You will have duels that are 50 minutes, because it takes forever to actually outgrind your opponent, because your monsters are really weak. But that doesn't really matter, because you have like so many resources. Once you resolve some of your milling cards, transaction rollback will get you so many resources over and over and over. Like I said, the huge drawback is that you will be on the ladder playing against even the worst of opponents. Like, the thing is, if you have a bad opponent and you're playing Fire King Snake Eye, the duel's going to last 2 turns. If you have a bad opponent and you're playing Paleozoic, the duel's still going to last 10 turns, because the deck just takes forever to actually do what you're trying to accomplish. They can make 10 misplays in a row, and it still would take you forever. Your monsters are 1200 attack. Even if you summoned all of them, it would take you, what is that, like, it would take you 7 monsters to actually accomplish anything. So that is the big drawback to this deck. It just takes forever to play. It would probably be higher and have a higher usage rate, because it's actually very good at Master Duel right now. It just takes forever to play, and I think that's why it's stuck in tier 3. Next, we've got Antagonisters. I'd say is like a Rogue deck. They are supposed to be getting support in the future. They have announced it. They announced it a while ago, and I think it's out in the OCG, but it just hasn't like come over here yet and to Master Duel and stuff like that. So I'd say it's probably somewhere around Rogue. Like I said, it's a little one-dimensional as of right now, but I think when the new support comes out, it'll be a lot better. You basically end on an unaffected monster, a token, and like, you know, like a few graveyard negates, which are kind of cool. Kind of the coolest negates that have come out in Yu-Gi-Oh! Recently are graveyard negates. Also, Chimera has this, where they can just negate things out of the graveyard. I'd say it's probably somewhere around Rogue. Dinosaurs, I'd say probably another Rogue deck. It's better than playing like Evolite and stuff like that, but Dinosaurs are in an iffy place right now, because it's tough to compete with some of these newer decks. It really is. It's tough to compete. It has a decent Yubel matchup, because it can send everything to the graveyard with what's his name, with Ultimate Conductor Tyranno. So it's decent. You book everything, send things to the graveyard. It's not bad. The problem is that the deck can, when you declare an attack, they can just summon like the Spirit of Yubel, and it just kind of kills that for you. So that's not bad. Fire King, like any deck that's really resilient, will just have better follow-up than Dinosaurs at this point, so it's a little rough. This deck's been getting better. This is Avoid at all costs. I wouldn't recommend playing it pure. This is Adventure. I almost want to bump it up. They have taken more and more of them off the ban list recently. Adventure, I think that's a pretty good move, right? Because the problem with Adventure is that it's just an engine that you never really want to see, when you're going second, because if your opponent has it and they just prevent you from using hand traps, it can be really infuriating to play against, because let's say you have a Nibiru, you can't really do anything about it. So it is kind of one of those like toxic engines, but it is coming back slowly and slowly and slowly. There are a lot of decks that can take use of it. I would say don't play it pure, but you know, there's a lot of decks that can actually benefit from it, like Synchrons, for example. Next is Exo Sisters. Depends on how important the graveyard is. The graveyard's very important right now, so I'd probably say it's tier 3. This deck relies entirely on your opponent. You know, not anymore, not entirely, because now they have Martha. So Martha can trigger things without your opponent having to use the graveyard. I'd say it's probably somewhere around tier 3. It just depends on how important the graveyard is in the moment. So I'd say probably tier 3. It's kind of, I wouldn't say it's as one-dimensional as like decks that completely rely on a single thing. It doesn't have to go first, it doesn't have to go second. It is kind of a versatile deck, and it can play D-Shifter, which is probably one of the biggest benefits of this deck, because D-Shifter is good against a lot of decks in the metagame. Less good against Yubel, because Yubel can recur from Banish, but it's very good against, like, for example, Fire King Snake Eye. It's very good against them. It's very good against Centurion. It's very good against regular Snake Eye, and it's very good against Chimera, for example. It's great against, like, it's good against a lot of decks, so that will in itself win you a lot of games. Next is Labyrinth. Labyrinth is, I would argue, a tier 2 deck. It's the best trap deck in the game currently. I don't think there is a trap deck that's better than this right now. Trap is less supported than other things in the game, just because people complain the most about trap decks, which is understandable. They don't want to hit this deck, and I don't think they're going to hit this deck, simply because it is it's a trap deck, and I feel like Konami needs to leave at least one trap deck in the metagame. It's why it's basically around in every festival. It's why it's basically around in the metagame, despite there being certain situations when this was literally a tier 1 deck and it sustained hits that are largely irrelevant, like it hit furniture. You know, they didn't hit the main cards, they hit furniture, which in the Floodgate build, you don't even play furniture. But with transaction rollback, this deck is very, very good. I'd say tier 2 is more than fair. Lightsworns is consider building something else. I think as of right now, Tearlaments is just objectively a better version. I think if the new Lightsworn support drops, you could definitely move this up. Maybe Rogue, maybe even tier 3. But as of right now, I'd say consider building something else, because Tearlaments just does it better as of right now. Raid Raptor, I'd say, is somewhere around Rogue. I would argue at this point, I would argue the new Raid Raptor support is quite good, but I would still argue that Black Wings is probably better than Raid Raptor at this point. Obviously, the decks do different things. They go in different directions. I would say Black Wings are probably less fragile. Black Wings also have a really good matchup against things like Yubel, for example. Like, they just have a better matchup than Yubel. They have a better matchup against Yubel than Raid Raptors do at this point. So I would argue that would be better. So I'd say probably somewhere around Rogue. Eldritch is kind of an interesting one, because it's still, as long as floodgates are hit, Eldritch is just not as strong. One thing that's positive about Eldritch is that they've taken most of the hits off of the ban list. Nobody's really playing Bystials as much anymore. If Bystials are around, Eldritch is terrible, but if Bystials aren't as relevant, suddenly Eldritch becomes a lot better. There's not a lot of decks the only decks that really run Bystials anymore are pretty much like branded decks. Like, outside of that, like maybe Dragon Link branded, that's it. So Bystials are not as relevant. I'd say it's somewhere around higher Rogue. Yeah, I used to put in consider building something else just because Labyrinth was objectively better, but I'd say Rogue, because they do different things. They're more continuous traps. This is more like normal traps. So I'd say if you want to play, it's probably somewhere around Rogue, but realistically, if you want to play a trap deck, Labyrinth is better at this point. Next is, this is the Insect deck. They just announced new support for, not Bee Troopers, but the Bee, is it Bee Troopers? I think it is Bee Troopers, you're right? No, Battle Wasps. They announced support for Battle Wasps, which is actually quite good. Realistically, this is actually like a pile deck. Yu-Gi-Oh! Has sort of, interestingly enough, right? Yu-Gi-Oh! Started, it was pile decks. It was just like, I'm going to play the best 40 cards that I can. And then it became, I'm going to play a Chaos deck. And then it became, I'm going to play an archetype. And archetypes took over. It was like Gladiator Beast, stuff like that. And recently, it's actually devolved back into pile decks, where pile decks are now becoming the best decks. So you have, like, this is an insect pile. This is a dinosaur pile. There are zombie piles. There are all kinds of pile decks now. And this is an insect pile deck. You just play all of the best insects you can muster together, and you go off from there. The deck can definitely do quite a few things. I'd say a fair place to put it would be somewhere in Rogue. I don't think it's going to have a tough time competing with some of the better decks, but Rogue is more than fair. Goukis are kind of the bottom of Rogue. I don't think it's too good right now. It depends. If generic links are powerful, then Goukis are very powerful because they don't really lock you into anything, which is actually one of the benefits of Goukis. And they're very good for linking because every time you link one away, you get to summon from hand, search, special summon. Like they're very good. They're very good for linking off because you get a lot of advantage off of it. So I'd say it's somewhere around Rogue for this deck because just a lot of the good generic link monsters have been hit, so they're not quite as good as they used to be. Monarchs is definitely like a Rogue deck. I'd say it's worse than Flunderies at this point because you can't play D-Shifter, and Maxi hurts you more than it does Flunderies. Despite all of the hits to Flunderies, I still think it's better than Monarchs. DDDs, as high skilled as this deck is, and it's very high skilled, you have to be incredibly intelligent to play DDDs. You could, like, you'd be an astrophysicist or play DDDs. That's how much intelligence and skill this deck takes to play. The problem with this deck is, like I said, it just has a tough time competing with some of the tier 1 decks. It's a good deck on its own. I don't think you can't mix it with, like, Unchained, unfortunately, despite being fiends. I mean, you can, but then you can't do stuff with Gilgamesh, which is your best card. So I'd say it's probably somewhere around Rogue in this meta. It's just very tough to go second against Snake Eye. Like, it really is, because Snake Eye is a bunch of 1-card combos, and they end with 2-3 hand traps. So it's just very difficult to deal with. Even if the Snake Eye board isn't the best board in the world, it's just tough to deal with the hand traps that they can still play despite... You know, they can play a large amount of hand traps, and you can't. You actually have to, like, pendulum summon and play a lot of DDDs. They can't afford to do. They can afford to play hand traps. You cannot. So it just kind of creates a very tough situation. This is another deck. I'll be straight up with you. I think it's terrible. This deck is Familiar Possessed. It's actually like a worse Magistus Spectre deck at this point. Basically, what this deck is the goal is to just summon a bunch of spellcasters that float. And then you end on like a Secret Village, maybe like a like a Magician's right arm or left arm, just to negate spells, stuff like that. It's not like it's a very gimmicky, simple strategy. It's something you can definitely play. It has to go first. It's very tough to go second with this deck. It really is. It's almost impossible to go second with this deck, especially if you're playing against like the higher tier meta decks. It's virtually impossible. So I'd say avoid at all costs. Definitely you can play. I'd say Magistus Spectre is just a better version of this at this point. Next, we've got Neos. Neos is a little underwhelming as a pure archetype. I'd say it's probably somewhere around Rogue. They're definitely better deck. I'd say Omni Heroes, they call it, where you mix a bunch of heroes all in one batch. It's probably the best way to play heroes, so this definitely goes somewhere in Rogue. Next, we've got Fortune Ladies, one of the worst archetypes ever made, undersupported. Konami just completely like forgot it existed. They gave him support through Fortune Lady a few years ago, and then they never supported it again. It's kind of like Element Sabers. Element Sabers came out in 2017. They never touched it again. This got support in 2018. They never touched it again, and that's why the two of these decks are stuck in obscurity. Adamancipator has gotten hit a bunch. Adamancipator isn't even really Adamancipator. It's another one. It's like a rock pile deck. It's where Yu-Gi-Oh's headed. It's a bunch of piles. Rock Pile right now I think is a decent deck, but I definitely think it's underwhelming compared to, again, it's like one of those decks where you don't have 1-card combos, you have like 1.5, 2-card combos, and the issue with having 1.5, 2-card combos, especially when they're non-linear, right? That's what you have to remember. They're non-linear combos. It's not like this card, it's not like one researcher is going to get you to a full end board in the way that some of these other decks can do it. This does not get you onto a full end board. Unfortunately, it just doesn't get you onto a full end board. It ends you on, essentially, you don't know what it's going to end you on because you're like milling off the top and hoping you see something good. Sometimes you mill and you whiff and you lose. So it's kind of the issue with this deck. When there's a luck factor, that's a problem. And when your combos rely on 2-3 cards, it can be a problem. And it's non-linear, so it's a lot more difficult to play. You're going to run out of time through the timer. There's a lot of issues here. Next, we've got Crystal Beasts. This is a good deck, actually. It's actually a decent rogue deck because it's quite simple. And you can run D-Shift. You can run every Floodgate can be run in this deck with the exception of I wouldn't recommend playing Skill Drain. You probably can't play through Skill Drain, but you can play through every other Floodgate in the game. Goes in and Skill Drain, I wouldn't recommend. But you can play like There Can Only Be One. You can play D-Shifter. You can play Macrocosmos. You can play a lot of stuff in this deck, and that is very, very potent against the higher meta decks. And you could, for a TV show deck, it's really good. But as of this point, the best deck in the game is a TV show deck, right? If you told me that Yubel was going to be the best deck in the game like 9 months ago, I'd think you were crazy. I'd be like, that card sucks. You can't do anything with it. And now the best deck in the meta is Jaden's ex-girlfriend, so that's a little rough. Next, we've got tunes. I'd say consider building something else. I think Watts are actually kind of like better tunes, but because they can attack the same turn they're summoned, but tunes have more protection because Toon Kingdom's like a really good card. So I'd say consider building something else. It's a cool TV show deck. If you wanna act like your Pegasus, you can act like your Pegasus. Walk around with a fake eyeball. You can do whatever you want, but I just don't think it can really compete with some of the higher tier decks. Pendulum pile is. It might be Rogue. Honestly, it might be Rogue right now. Rogue Tier 3 has a terrible Kashtira matchup, but Kashtira is not as prevalent as it used to be. I'd say it's probably in Tier 3. Yeah, it's probably in Tier 3. Like I said, it has some matchups that are just very tough. It can have a lot of trouble going second against an established board. Just pendulums in general have trouble with that sometimes. I'd say it's probably somewhere around Tier 3, like a generic pile pendulum deck, somewhere around there. Omni Heroes is probably like a Tier 3 deck. Once you summon a Darklaw, you basically win, especially against some of the higher tier decks. They need the graveyard. Darklaw doesn't allow the graveyard. Not a lot of people are playing Nibiru and Dark Ruler or more and stuff like that, so that can actually be quite beneficial for you. I'd say Tier 3 is quite fair. Next, we've got Shaddolls. I'd say Shaddolls, consider building something else. Realistically, Shaddolls, there are a lot better fusion decks at this point in the game. I think Shaddolls is definitely very underwhelming, considering, like I said, there's just so many. There's like Branded is better, Chimera is better, even Heroes I would argue is better. Yubel, without a doubt, right? The other Jaden card is better than Yubel is better than Shaddolls right now. There's just so many better fusion decks to play. I would say this is probably just Rogue. Next is Blue Eyes. Blue Eyes is in Rogue for sure. Blue Eyes is like a weird one because it has like 5 or 6 good cards and then just a bunch of really bad cards. And the problem with Blue Eyes is, number one, they're getting new support that's like actually good. Like legitimately, like a few months from now, I might be putting Blue Eyes up here. Like that's how good the new support is. If you haven't checked it out, go check it out. They announced that it's in the OCG right now. It's a structure deck, so there's like 5 new cards. Actually really good. The only thing in Master that's changed is they've added Magia, which is a good card, but it's very, I don't want to say it's like very difficult to summon, but it's definitely not easy to summon either. It's like one of those things where it's possible to summon it, but it may take you a few turns to summon it. And although it's a cool card, it will take you. The best decks I've seen that summon it is probably like a Dogmatica variant. I've seen that summons it. I've seen some other variants, but like I said, it's kind of a deck. It's kind of a card that's not the easiest to summon, and sometimes you have to sink your whole hand into summoning one of it. You can definitely summon it with like an Endear Servant and a fusion, not deployment, the other fusion armament. If you use those 2 cards, you can get to it, but it's like a very specific unsearchable 2-card combo. So I'd say it's kind of, it doesn't really help the deck as much as you would think that it would help. I'd say it's probably somewhere in Rogue. Wind-Up's another Rogue deck. It got a lot of hype when it first got like taken off the ban list, a few of the cards, but realistically, I just don't think this deck's enough. It can hand loop and stuff, but I think that strategy is just a little too outdated for our purposes now. This is Windwitches. Definitely consider building something else. I think it's just very underwhelming as a synchro deck. The problem with it is it's fair, like, and that's it. I know it sounds like not good, but that's how modern Yu-Gi-Oh is. If your deck is fair, it's not good enough. So basically, this uses your hand to summon like a Crystal Wing or a level 8 Synchro or a level 10 Synchro that is wind. It has to be a wind Synchro because it locks you. So it used to be enough because you could like mix that with like spell trap cards like Floodgates and stuff like that. You could sit on like a Crystal Wing and then back row. But now it's just not enough because it really does like kind of spend your hand, which I would argue is not good enough. Next, we've got Phantasm Spirals. Is always going to be a really good Rogue deck just because a lot of the things that hurt other decks, are irrelevant to this deck. So you can main deck every Floodgate, and I really do mean every Floodgate. And then you can main deck Shifter, you can main deck any hand trap you want. Like, the versatility of this deck is probably its best attribute. It's very good at dealing with a lot of things. It does have a bad Yubel matchup because you only get to really pop 3 cards, and then you can't pop any more cards. And that, I would argue, is probably the worst part of the deck, is that it just has a very, very bad Yubel matchup. Yubel is very resilient, and it continues to put up that board where if you attack, you get burned, and this deck can only get rid of Nightmare Pain so many times, and then you just kind of lose. So that's kind of the issue with that deck. Infernoids is a deck I'd say probably sits a going second, kind of like break your opponent's board over and over kind of a deck. I'd say it's probably somewhere around Rogue. It is getting new support. I don't know if the new support is enough to carry it across the finish line. I would say it's going to be better, but yeah, how much better, I don't know. I think it's probably still going to be a Rogue deck just because the top decks are so much better than all the other decks. Next in the Rogue deck, it's Subterror. It's the best flip effect deck in the game. It is good. Like, it can play every Floodgate. There's another deck that can play every Floodgate, but again, Konami and Master Duel has hit so many Floodgates that at this point, playing every Floodgate isn't really that many because they've hit so many. So other than skill drain, you could basically main deck every Floodgate. There can only be one, but every one of them is essentially at 1 at this point. So it's very limited to what you can do. Also, you don't have Dragoon to fall back on, so it's not quite as good. Next is Spiral. Spirals is probably like a Rogue combo deck. It's one of the better combo decks in the game. It's one of the better classic like Link era combo decks that exist in the game, but honestly, those just aren't good enough anymore. It's true. It's might be sad for some of you to hear, but like the Link era Master Rule 4 decks, that style of deck isn't good enough. The new decks are so much better because they have 1-card combos, number 1. Number 2, they have more recursion. The problem with a lot of the Link era decks, the Link era Master Rule 4 decks, is they don't have a lot of recursion, whereas the newer decks have so much recursion. So that can be a little bit of an issue with this. Battery Man, I'd say consider building something else. Just play Thunder Dragons. Don't play this. This is Altergeist. It got new support actually recently. I'd say the new support is definitely good. It raises the ceiling of the deck a little bit, which is what the deck needed, because I would say the biggest issue with this deck is that the ceiling was also always very low, because it was always like you end on like a protocol, and then you have the multi-faker loop where you activate protocol, negate a spell trap, and then you can summon like a multi-faker, and then negate not a spell trap, a monster effect, but you could summon and multi-faker, and then you could summon Silkwood, you could bounce a card. It's very, in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, very underwhelming. It was great in Master Rule 4 because there was a limited amount of things that your opponent could even accomplish, but it is very underwhelming in today's game. Blackwing, I think, is somewhere in Rogue. It has some good matchups. It has a great Yubel matchup because you just burn and burn and burn and burn, and you don't have to stress about, like, the more they play, the more they get burned. You don't have to worry about, I'm going to attack. Plus, they have a monster that's unaffected, so even when it does attack, it still does damage. So that's kind of cool because it doesn't do damage to you because it's unaffected. Or maybe it does. I got to double check. But it basically, the burn aspect of it's quite good. I'd say it's one of the better Rogue decks. Next is Gravekeepers. I'd say it's probably like a bottom Rogue deck. I think the problem with this deck is it relies too heavily on Necro Valley, which is amazing right now. Like, every deck up here is hurt by Necro Valley. Every single one of them. The problem is, if you go second, like, what are you going to do? What the deck needs is a hand trap quick effect that can place Necro Valley on the field during your opponent's turn. I think that's the only way to fix this deck at this point, because going second with it is just so horrific. You cannot accomplish anything. But if you go first, you essentially, as long as you can put Necro Valley on field and protect it, you pretty much will always win the duel. Pretty much always. Next is FAs. FA's cool. I'd say it's probably consider building something else. Honestly, there's just so many better Synchro decks like Centurion and Resonators. Like, so many less complicated Synchro decks in the game. I would say steer your way towards that. It'd be a lot better. Magical Musketeer is a little underwhelming too. It's a light Fiend deck, so maybe when Fiendsmith comes out, people were hyping this deck up a lot, but I think Fiendsmith has better homes than this deck. I think it has a better home in a lot of other decks in Yubel and Fire King and stuff like that, so you're definitely going to find better areas to play it than this, but I think it's probably like a Rogue deck. Cyber Angels is an underwhelming ritual deck. I'd say it's probably in consider building something else. Like I said, the problem with this deck is it's unbelievably fair. You don't really get to cheat out a lot of free ritual summons like you do in Drytron and in Libromancers and stuff like that. So because it's so fair and ritual is such an underwhelming type, like deck type, it actually puts it in like a weird spot where you actually have to tribute monsters and you actually have to tribute cards in hand, which I know is the real summoning mechanic, but in modern Yu-Gi-Oh, doing what a summoning mechanic is supposed to do isn't good enough anymore. That's kind of the issue there. Time Thief as a pure deck is... The monster's good. Time Thief Redoer is a great card, but as a pure deck, it's definitely underwhelming. It's definitely underwhelming, mostly because the boss monsters are not quite good enough. Time Thief Redoer is a cool card, but the other two, like the girl, more so just kind of serves the archetype. Same thing with the double... Is it double Helix? I forget his name, but it's the double something. It's the Time Thief double something, but there's like two different Time Thieves on it. And it's just not... I don't think it's good enough. It's not a good enough boss monster. Redoer is the best card in the entire archetype. You do have a few cool starters, but overall, I just don't... I think this is another deck that's just lacking extra deck monsters, kind of like TG's, kind of like some of the other decks that I mentioned previously. It just lacks the extra deck, but it has the main deck quite figured out. Dragon Link is probably like tier 3. You don't have to worry about Bystials as much anymore. Also, the other issue is Bystials aren't as effective anymore. If Fire King Snake Eye is one of the best decks and you have Bystials, it really doesn't do anything against Fire King Snake Eye. The only thing you can really banish is the Diabellstar Witch. Other than that, you're not really banishing anything else. Banishing her does help, and you do get the search, so I guess that's good. Like I said, Dragon Link is quite decent. It will always be a decent deck because it is basically a dragon pile, and Konami loves dragons. I think there are more powerful dragons than anything else because they love dragons and they give them broken support every 6 to 9 months. They just will drop some dragon and you're just like in shock at how good it is. So I think tier 3 is probably fair. Like I said, if these two get hit, this whole entire thing scoots up and then this becomes probably a tier 2 deck. But, you know, we'll have to see it to believe it. This is Photon / Galaxy Eyes. I'd say this is probably like a rogue deck, but this deck is going to get a lot better because they're new cards that are coming out, which is kind of crazy that there's new cards coming out because cards just came out. Like, we just had an update with new cards for this archetype. We just had a new set with this on the cover. Like, that's crazy to me that this is already getting new support. But, you know, what can you do? They're coming out with new support. This deck has unbelievable search power. I don't know how a deck that has as much search power, foolish burial power as this deck can still be so inconsistent. But the new support is very good. They're basically getting a card that is going to be like Snake Eye Poplar, which is, I mean, every deck wishes for a Snake Eye Poplar, and I think that's the direction that Yu-Gi-Oh's headed. Every deck is going to get a Snake Eye Poplar, which is like, it has 3 really broken effects all on a single Yu-Gi-Oh card, and I think that's the future of the game. Yeah, I think it's cheating summoning mechanics and a Snake Eye Poplar for every archetype. Blue Eyes is getting a card that's like Snake Eye's Poplar, which just has like 3 broken effects. This deck is getting a Snake Eye Poplar, it's like 3 broken effects. That will definitely move the deck up somewhere here. Like I said, the deck has a ton of search power, but I think the end boards are a little bit iffy on this deck. And I'd say that's probably the largest kind of issue with this deck at this point, from what I've seen. Next is Cyber Dragon. I think Cyber Dragon is probably in Rogue. This is like pure Cyber Dragon, not counting like the dark cards. It's just Cyber Dragon. So pure Cyber Dragon is quite a good deck. Very good at OTKing, probably somewhere around Rogue. Jinzo, I'd say, can avoid at all costs. If you've listened to this video at any point, you've realized that traps are very much not a large part of the game right now. Every deck will play some, like maybe one searchable trap card, like a counter trap, but for the most part, trap cards are largely irrelevant in this game. You can play this deck against Labyrinth, but Labyrinth can out this very easily. Labyrinth has no trouble with Jinzo because you can still summon the 3000 attack monster and just out the Jinzo. Jinzo is just not very threatening in modern Yu-Gi-Oh! It's sad to see because he used to be one of my favorite monsters ever. Like, if you went into a time machine and interviewed me in 2005, I'd be like, yep, Jinzo, I love Jinzo, he's my favorite monster, I love him. Now you go to the future and Jinzo's very underwhelming, where he doesn't do anything and he's washed up and it sucks, but he is. Next is Predaplants. I'd say it's probably like a rogue deck. The biggest thing is, realistically, it's kind of like Super Poly, the deck, but the problem is you literally have Super Poly, the actual deck, which is Yubel. So there's a deck out there that is just doing what this deck does, but just better. Yubel is just better Predaplants. And you cheat, so you don't need to actually search these things out. You can search Super Poly, but again, Yubel is just a better version of this card in every single way. I would say if you're playing this, you probably should just pick up Yubel because it's a better version of it. Next is Dragon Maids. I'd say Dragon Maids somewhere around Rogue. This used to be like a tier 3 deck, but again, it's just its ceiling is very low. I think its starters are actually quite good, but what it can actually accomplish is very underwhelming. It can be used partially as an engine in like Dragon Link and stuff, and I think it's probably better served in there than it is in its own pure deck. Mathmech has continuously gotten hit, but despite that, it's still quite an annoying deck to play against. Generally speaking, still quite an annoying deck to play against as a rogue matchup. It's still not as a rogue match. It's probably like still tier 3. It's still one of the better Cyberse decks to ever be released, and Cyberse being a newer type, is just better than a lot of other typings because it doesn't have like the legacy types that are just really, really bad. So it is kind of overall quite good. Aromatherapy / Aromage is probably in consider building something else. I would probably argue you should build a plant pile. This deck is actually getting new support, but that again just serves to better equip the plant pile deck. I wouldn't recommend playing this deck pure. I've recently actually played it pure, despite not recommending you playing it pure. And it is a fun deck. I like it a lot. I think it's a cool mechanic. I think it's a very creative mechanic. You gain life points, you get to do stuff. I think it's really cool. But it's just underwhelming. It's not good enough to compete with a lot of decks. Next is Kwakimaru. This is definitely an avoid at all costs. Never play this pure, ever. The deck is just all over the place. Just play the rock ones in Adamancipators or Tremids or Rock Stun or one of those decks. But definitely don't play it pure because it'll just not end well for you. Next is one of the best trap decks in the game, and it's only Rogue. So I think Trap Tricks is very good. It's gotten some really good support over the years. If it goes first, you're basically winning. Going second can be a little bit more difficult. You're very reliant on Sarah. If Sarah gets stopped, sometimes you lose. The deck, they did fix a lot of things about the deck, like you have 2 normal summons now, you have protection, stuff like that. I'd say the biggest issue with the deck, like I said, is very Sarah reliant. And if you go first, you win. If you go second, you can have a lot of trouble. Phantom Knights, definitely another rogue matchup. It can benefit from like the XYZ armor stuff because it is a rank 3 deck, so it can benefit 100% from that. It can also benefit, you can't really mix it, like you can mix it with Burning Abyss, but you can't mix it with, for example, Unchained, because they're not fiends, they're warriors, so that can be a little bit of an issue. So I'd say it's probably somewhere around Rogue. Dragoonity, I'd say, is a rogue deck. I think it honestly is just a worse Dragon Link. Dragoonity is cool, but again, it really is just a worse Dragon Link. You do have some like Wing Beasts mixed in there. I guess it's slightly different. A lot of it's nostalgia, and a lot of people played that archetype, you know, during the 5Ds era, and they like it a lot. But if we're going to be objective about it, I think Dragon Link is just a better version of this deck. You can play some of the cards in this deck in Dragon Link. Like you can play, for example, Remus in Dragon Link, and he can search you. He can search you a Dragon's Ravine, for example. Like there's definitely cool things that you can do with some of the Dragoonity cards, but I would recommend just playing Dragon Link. And even Dragon Link isn't good enough to be a top like tier 1 deck. Next is Live Twins. I would say Live Twins are probably like a rogue deck. Somewhere around here, you can mix it with sprites, and that's probably the best place to mix it with, and it makes it the best in sprites. But again, it's just a bit underwhelming at this point when you compare it to like modern decks. It does have 1-card starters, which is quite cool, but like the 1-card starter will, yeah, it does have 1-card starters, but like the 1-card starter end board is very underwhelming. You want to draw like a Live Twin card plus, oh yeah, you have to a Live Twin card. You want to draw a Live Twin card and then maybe like a sprite, and then you can do an actual combo. But if you draw like just a Live Twin card, it's just not good enough. Next is Burning Abyss. I'd say this is another deck. It's probably next to Phantom Knights. It can definitely utilize the foolish, the Unchained cards better than some of the other decks, but I think that there are better decks that utilize the Unchained cards, like Pure Unchained or Labyrinth or Yubel. I think they just utilize them much better than Burning Abyss. There's no like weird overlap that's negative. This is another deck that I'd say is probably Rogue. This is Noble Knights. It's a cool deck, and they were mixing it for a while with Snake Eye, but the problem with Snake Eye is since Ash got hit, the kind of mixed variants of it aren't as popular anymore. The best variant at this point is probably just going to be, the Fire King Snake Eye is probably the best way to play it. So it's probably somewhere around there. This is Zombie Pile, kind of like, again, it's kind of like a pile deck. You mix all the best zombies that have ever come out, Zombie World, and you play that way. I'd say it's probably like a Rogue deck. I wouldn't play it at tier 3 anymore. I used to put it in tier 3, but I think it's just underwhelming because converting the types right now isn't the biggest deal because they can still kind of combo through that. Like the top tier decks up there don't really care. Other than like searching a level 1 Pyro, they don't care once the monster's actually on the board. They just care about the attribute. So as of right now, I'd probably say it's somewhere in Rogue. Next is, this will always be pretty much a tier 3, maybe above deck. If you can run D-Shifter and Max C and a bunch of other Floodgates and not have to worry about your opponent maxing you or D-Shifting, like there are so many cards that are played in most decks, they're absolutely dead against Flunderees, like Call by the Grave, for example. You don't have to play, you don't have to worry about Call by the Grave. Like there's so many things that you just don't have to worry about in Flunderees, and that's why it'll always be a strong deck. Honestly, I could argue this. If this deck was at full power, you could argue it'd be tier 1. But it is very much hit on the ban list, and it is very much hit on the ban list. And on top of that, I think that's the only thing really stopping it is just a bunch of ban list hits. I think if this was at full power, it would be a tier 1 deck. Without a doubt. This is another deck that I'd say is probably tier 3. This is Sword Soul. Sword Soul is a very fair deck, and that's what holds it back from being above this. I think it's unbelievably fair. I think there are significantly less fair decks, and this deck doesn't really... What one card combo does it have? The only one card combo that it has is the spell card, and that's it. Like, there's the spell card, I'm forgetting its name, but it's a spell card that searches a Tenyi not a Tenyi, it's a spell card that searches a Sword Soul monster. You can activate that, and then you can search the guy who banishes out of the graveyard, and that is a 1-card combo. That's the only 1-card combo that you really have. Most things are a 2-card combo. When you're competing with 1-card combos against 2-card combos, it can be very difficult. Next is Kairu Shin / Umi. This deck is probably like Rogue. It's a better Rogue deck than most Rogue decks because Kairu Shin is just a disgusting card. It does have a good matchup against a lot of decks like Snake Eye Fire King. It has a pretty good matchup, except they can search out Subversion, which will just put Kairu Shin in the back row, and then you'll never get him back, and it just turns off the Floodgate without having to destroy him. So it has a bad matchup against a lot of decks up here. It has a very bad matchup against Labyrinth. It has a very bad matchup against this deck. Yubel, if you're playing into an established board, it can still be difficult if they just leave one monster on the field. It can be a little bit difficult to deal with. So it definitely has some bad matchups, but I would say it has more good matchups than bad matchups for sure. It just can be a little bit bricky, especially since a lot of cards have been hit, like Foolish Burial of Goods got hit and other stuff got hit that have negatively affected this deck. Sylvans, I'd say consider building something else, kind of like Aromatherapy or Aromage cards. It's just, I would recommend a plant pile deck. As a solo deck, I don't think it does enough. This is actually a pretty good deck, Dinomorphia. I think it's a solid Rogue deck. It's a good Rogue deck. It can play a lot of Floodgates. I wouldn't say all of them, but it can definitely play a lot of Floodgates, and that can help it. And on top of that, it's just such a weird, like, sideways playstyle. It's so different from everybody else that can actually benefit you a lot. It does fuse out of the graveyard and stuff like that, so it does have some kind of, like, interesting, weird things that it can do. I'd say it's probably somewhere in Rogue. This is Despia. Despia is a tier 2 deck easily. It could even maybe make an argument for tier 1. It's insane how long this deck has existed in this game and has been tier 2 and above. It is absolutely insane how long this deck has been relevant. Like, I don't even, like, when was the last time this deck wasn't relevant? It's insane. It's still very good because it has so much resiliency, and despite continuously getting hit, it's still very good. Can you imagine if they unhit this deck? Like, seriously, it is still relevant. The thing is, though, honestly, I think if they unhit the deck, it'd still be in the same spot because the decks above it are just that much better that even if this deck was at full power and it had 3 branded fusions and 3 Elubers and 3 branded openings, I think honestly it would still be in tier 2. That's how good these 2 decks are. Next is Thunder Dragon. Thunder Dragon is a cool matchup against a lot of decks. It does beat, like if you go first and you set up Colossus, you can definitely accomplish a lot because Colossus can stop a lot of the higher tier decks. But I'd argue it's still probably in tier 3. Next is Invoked. Invoked is, again, it's just a fusion deck that's underwhelming. It doesn't even have like a super poly aspect to it. It has a super poly out of your opponent's graveyard kind of an aspect to it, where you can banish cards out of your opponent's graveyard, like they have an Ash and you can use it to make a Purgatrio, or if they Veiler you, you can use it to make a Mecha Buff, for example. But that aspect is very underwhelming when you compare it to Yubel, which confuse your entire board. So I think it's probably somewhere in Rogue. Lyrilusk is probably, Lyrilusk Tri-Brigade is probably somewhere in Rogue too. It's just not good enough, I think, to compete with some of the higher tier decks. And with the Wind Barrier statue is really what always put this deck over the top. With that gone, I don't think it's quite as good. Salamangreat is actually quite a good deck. I think it's somewhere at the top of tier 3, actually. It's a very good deck. It just lost a card that was important to it, which was, it just lost Kaiser Coliseum, which was allowing it to play through Nibiru, which is actually kind of crazy. The deck is actually quite good, very resilient. A friend of mine actually got, I think, 44th place in the world in the last Duelist Cup with this deck. And this was during Snake Eye Fire King, like full power. No, it was just Snake Eye. It was a full power. Actually, it was Fire King. I think, yeah, it was Snake Eye Fire King full power. And this deck, he actually got 44th place in the world, I think, with this, which is like insane. It's a really good deck. Next is Scareclaw. I think Scareclaw is probably a rogue deck. Again, they hit a few things. Actually, I'd probably say it's probably tier 3. If they hit a few things, I think this moves up. But the issue is, again, it's just has a tough time competing against some of the more established boards. Tryhard is a great boss monster in this archetype. It's a great card, but sometimes great is still not good enough. Next is Sky Striker. This is a deck that I used to hate, but you know, the enemy of my enemy is my friend, so I think it's somewhere around Rogue right now. It's just, even with a new support, I don't think it's good enough. It's another deck that's kind of stuck in 2018, and it used to rely very much on Mystic Mind, but with Mystic Mind gone, this deck is a lot less threatening, because Mystic Mind used on another level of annoying in this deck, but with Mystic Mind gone, this deck is definitely not as threatening anymore. I'd say it's probably at a higher tier of Rogue. The new support is good, but I don't think it puts the deck over the top. The extra deck monsters it got are good because it lets them like have monsters that come back in the next phase and stuff like that. That's all cool, but I don't think it's quite good enough. Tritron is probably, it's still a really strong deck. It's still the best ritual deck in the game. I think it's tier 3. Again, it just cheats rituals, which makes it automatically better than other ritual decks that actually have to follow the rules of ritual summoning. Next, we've got Utopia. This deck is so all over the place. There's so many different ways to play it. The number one way I see on the ladder is the FTK bot, if I'm being honest with you. The other ways to play it, I think this deck suffers from the same thing that Galaxy Eye suffers from, where it's like they've gotten so much support, you don't even know what the best version of the deck even is. And it's so like, it varies player by player, but regardless of the variety player by player, it's still not good enough to like beat Snake Eye, for example. This is Gladiator Beasts. Modern Gladiator Beasts are just, it's not good enough. The classic Gladiator Beasts are definitely not good enough, but the modern ones are not good enough. They play more like a generic strategy now where they have like negates and stuff like that, but I still don't think it's a good enough deck. This is Plunder Patrol. I think it's higher Rogue. It benefits from like the surprise factor of most people not knowing how to play through it. It is a very cool play style, like it equip stuff, but generally speaking, I think it's probably like a higher tier Rogue deck, but again, it just has trouble competing with some of the better decks in the game. Sharks lost Totally Awesome. We need Totally Awesome back. I'd say it's probably like middle of Rogue. With Totally Awesome gone, it definitely suffers, but it did get the XYZ armored engine, which is quite good, but I'd say it's probably somewhere around Rogue. This is Orcust. This is a deck that everyone was like so hyped about when a few cards came off the ban list, but as we've seen, it really hasn't done anything. Hopefully it can do a little bit more, but like I said, they can unlock the entire deck and it wouldn't make a difference because the newer decks are just so damn good that it doesn't matter. Like I said, a lot of these Link era decks are just not good enough anymore. They were built for 2018. They weren't built for 2024, and they have a lot of time, a lot of trouble competing. All right, next up we've got Administrator. This is a trap deck. I think that is a decent trap deck. I think it's cool game design, but I don't think it's quite good enough to be played in the higher tiers of the game. I think that Labyrinth is just objectively a better trap deck than this. So for that reason, I think this deck definitely goes over here. Next we've got Virtual World. I think Virtual World is, you could argue it's a tier 3 deck. I'd say it's more of a rogue deck. It's a very good rogue deck, but I wouldn't, yeah, tier 3 might be a little tougher to do with just generally the resources that it has left to work with. I think are a little underwhelming when you compare it to some of the better decks. I'd say it's probably somewhere in rogue. I wouldn't recommend playing it. This is another deck I wouldn't recommend. Ghost Trick is just, no matter how many waves of support they give this deck, it's just not good enough. The core mechanic of the deck is just not strong enough. They have to give them like main deck cards that can just book everything or something like that. Like, they have to give them more broken cards to make it more usable. This is Marincess. I think Marincess is probably like around tier 3. It's one of the better Link decks. I think that honestly, this deck is getting better because it's getting a new support card after this. But again, it's just kind of, it's tough to compete with the higher tier decks. I'd say it's probably somewhere around tier 3. It is a good deck. Maybe not the best deck, but it's definitely a tier 3 deck, and it can beat most decks on this list, which is nice. Next is Machina / just Earth Machine. I think Earth Machine is probably around here. The problem with Earth Machine is that you combo for like 10 minutes and then you end on a board of like 2 monsters and a trap card, and I think that's the problem with it. It has a lot of recursion, but maybe not, it doesn't have the best end board, and I'd say that's probably the biggest issue with this deck. Next we've got Tri-Brigade. This is another deck that by modern standards is just largely underwhelming because it basically ends on a trap card and maybe an Appaloosa. It's like an Appaloosa and a Revolt face down. It's not, in past metas that was good enough. As a matter of fact, not only was that good enough, that was better than other decks. That used to be the best thing you could possibly do. Now it's just not enough. Next is Mech Knights. It's a going second deck, inherently more difficult to go in second, even if you build around it. I'd say it's probably somewhere around Rogue. It used to be mixed with other things like Invoked, but I just don't think that that's good enough in the modern game. Weather Painters with 1 skill drain is a little rough. I'd say it's probably somewhere around Rogue. 3 skill drains probably moves it up a little bit, but I think it's just an underwhelming deck. Cool design, but underwhelming. Harpy is another deck this is a deck that needs a wave of support. This really needs a wave of support, like really badly, because it has trouble competing with modern decks. Its last support wave was really good, but that was a long time ago at this point. I mean, like, when was that? Like 20... The last time it got real support, like a full wave, was 2018. After that, it got the Cyberse / Harpy. And then it got that Dragon, the remake of the Dragon, which was a little underwhelming. Again, pretty underwhelming. It sends a Harpy. It sends a Harpy from deck. Oh no, a Wing Beast from deck, which is like, it doesn't actually benefit the deck that much because you can send Harpist, but that's about it. So it's just a little too underwhelming. Runic is an annoying deck and will always be high rogue, maybe even tier 3. I think it's still tier 3. Despite all of the hits, it's still tier 3 because the playstyle is so odd and it mills your opponent's deck. And if they don't have an out to it, if they don't have an out or they can't stop the field spell, you're gonna win. I'd say it's probably still in like tier 3 rogue. Naturi is a pretty good deck now. I'd say it's probably, you can make the argument, tier 3 with the new stuff. It's quite good. Naturi, Runic. Again, the issue with Naturi and Runic is that Runics have been hit so severely that it's tough to really say where it would be, because it's like when one archetype is so hit and you're reliant on having both of them, it could be a little bit weird. With Dolces is, I'd say, a rogue deck, but it's getting new support that's actually quite good. It's getting a new trap. It's getting 2 extra deck monsters, a new Link and an Xseed monster. Both very good. All 3 cards are very good. The trap card, I think, is probably the best of that support, just because it lets you bounce 2 back. I mean, it's pretty good. So I'd say it's probably around Rogue. Next, we've got Mermils. This is another deck I'd say is in Rogue, but it's getting new support, so I guess keep keep your eye out for that. Be hopeful. It is cool. The new support is quite good. I'd say probably we'll move it up to tier 3, tier 2 maybe. It just depends on what other generic water support they'll drop out of nowhere. Cleafort's is another like tribute deck. I think it's just worse than Flundereeze. It's a more complicated, worse Flundereeze. If Skill Drain was 3, it'd be better, but with Skill Drain at 1, it's just not quite good enough. Next, we've got another... this is a going second OTK fusion deck. This is Fluffles. I don't think that this deck is quite good enough at this point, just because going second deck is just inherently very difficult. And then you combine with the fact that you have decks that are very resilient and don't lose to OTKs very easily, and you combine that with the fact that there's just a better fusion deck out there in a deck that super polys the whole board. I'd say it's probably somewhere in Rogue. Next, we've got Red Eyes. Red Eyes doesn't have any support announced, actually. Actually, no, I'm wrong. It has they have new support for Metal Morph. Yes, the Metal Morph, the one you're thinking of, the one that Bandit Keith used to turn things into half metal. That is getting support. The Red Eyes is getting a new card. That card's actually not bad, honestly. I think it's a negate. It's really not bad. I'd say you have to play an extra brick, but again, that's in the future. As of right now, I think it's a Rogue deck, nothing too great. This I wouldn't recommend playing pure. It sucks. It's just it relies on your opponent popping spell and trap cards. They're probably not going to pop spell and trap cards, so that's a little underwhelming. Farm Girl and Cosmos are probably like a lower tier Rogue deck. I think it's a cool deck. It doesn't need the extra deck and is a large benefit to the deck, but I think generally speaking, I don't think it's, as far as Rogue decks go, I don't think it's super duper powerful. Then we've got Speedroids, I think is like kind of like middle of Rogue. It is good win synchro deck. It's got cool monsters that it definitely can summon, but I would say it's certainly a bit too underwhelming for me. Next is consider building something else. This is Black Luster Soldier, the deck. I don't see this deck is not. I mean, it's just very, very, very underwhelming as a ritual deck. It is completely fair. I would say it's even unfair. Not to your opponent. It's unfair to you. How much you have to sink in resource-wise to summon monsters that are just not that good. They're just not. They are really not. And I'd say it's probably consider building something else. Next is another consider building something else. This is Sharanui. Don't play Sharanui. Always just play a zombie pile. Sharanui has very, very little, has a lot of difficulty with setup. So, I mean, maybe you can play it with like Horus and you can put stuff in the graveyard, but I would say Sharanui is really underwhelming. Veocroid is one of the worst decks ever made. Like ever made. It's terrible. There's just very little that the deck can actually accomplish. Every single card in the archetype is stuck in like 2007. It's an underwhelming archetype at every metric. Next is Magician Girls. Just play Dark Magician. Magician Girls honestly really suck. Other than Chocolate Magician Girl, but all the other ones suck. Next is this is True Dracos. True Dracos probably Rogue deck, middle of Rogue deck. The issue with this is that, again, a lot of the Floodgates got hit. This is one of the most Floodgate reliant decks in the game. Also, Masterpiece is still banned. Honestly, shouldn't even be banned at this point, let's be honest. But yeah, this card is banned. It really shouldn't be. Buster Blader is another kind of Rogue deck. It has to go first. Going second with Buster Blader does pretty much nothing because you have to go first, turn everything into dragons, change everything to defense. Like, you have to do that whole combo, and if you're going second, it's already too late, especially if you're playing through multiple negates. This is Digital Bugs. Digital Bugs is not good enough. I'd say just play generic, like Insect Link. Don't play Digital Bugs. It is 100% not good enough. Next is Fairy Tale. Not Fairy Tale, the deck. This is rank 8, 8 axis, the most expensive deck in the game. And honestly, it's not worth it. It's a tier 3 deck and it's the most expensive deck in the game. I'm telling you this as somebody who has it. It is not good enough, especially with the resiliency of the modern decks. It is just simply not good enough. You do play a bunch of board breakers and you can break the board, but it's very difficult. Like on the follow-up, they'll usually beat you if you don't OTK them. Exodia is at this point avoided at all costs, but Exodia is getting new support. If that support drops, it definitely moves up because it's a lot easier to draw the Exodia pieces and play Exodia in general once that support comes out. Spellbooks is, I'd say, a lower tier Rogue deck. I think it's okay, but by modern standards, well outdated. I don't think it's good enough. Crusadia is a cool OTK deck. Used to be able to go first, but with Crystron gone, it will never be able to go first ever again. It can make like a Crusadia Avermax going first, but that's honestly not good enough. Prank Kids, I think, is a slept-on deck. I think it's high Rogue, maybe even tier 3. The more of the adventure package comes back, the better this deck becomes. On top of that, it's one of the few fusion decks that can actually, like, it can actually make up for the resources that you're burning, so, which is kind of cool. So I'd say it's probably somewhere around Rogue. This is Zodiacs. I think it's another, like, higher tier Rogue deck. It's cool. I think it has its purposes, its uses. I think it's a very cool deck, but it can easily go into Zeus, for example, and that's usually the way to play it, is Zeus Turbo. But you can also use the Armored XYZ package. It's quite good in it. Pendulum, this is Endymion. I'd say most people play Endymion, play, you know, the other generic Pendulum support. It's probably somewhere around tier 3. It's good, but not good enough. I just learned that this is Dream Mirror, by the way. Dream Mirror is definitely avoided at all costs. It's a deck that I love everything about this deck. Everything. I just learned that it was based on Silent Hill a couple of days ago. This deck has amazing artwork, maybe some of the best artwork in the entire game. On top of that, this deck has a beautiful playstyle. Like, I love the playstyle. You switch out the field spells. You can do different things with the monsters you have on board. I love that about the deck. Everything about this deck I love, except for the fact that it's just not good enough. The effects on the cards are simply not broken enough, because they have very underwhelming effects. And if they have effects that are that underwhelming, they can't accomplish anything. You are not beating Snake Eye with this deck, unless they brick. You are not beating Yubel with this deck, even if they brick. Like, this deck is, it's very underwhelming. Next, we've got Ancient Gears. I'd say for now, consider building something else, because there is new support on the horizon, and that support is very good. Like, very good. And I'm honestly excited to play it in Master Duel. It is very, very strong support. It goes second, and honestly, it's a really, really good going second deck. Symphonic Warriors, I think, is a rogue deck that is just very underwhelming. Symphonic Warriors, did I say? I meant to say it's a pendulum deck that is very underwhelming. You can do a few 1.5 card combos that end you on, like, decent boards. I would say anything too crazy, you can end on like 3 interruptions. But generally speaking, I think this is one of those decks that you'll rarely ever run into. No one will ever be. You might run into it one time ever. It's a very underwhelming deck. Libromancer is a really good ritual engine, and you can mix it with certain ritual decks. It's one of those things that it cheats out ritual summons, which makes it quite good. It's very high rarity, but I'd say it's probably somewhere around Rogue. Yeah, Rogue is probably fair for that. ABCs is probably around, like, middle of Rogue, top half of Rogue. This is also getting new support that's actually really good. There's a lot of 1-card combos you'll actually be able to do in ABCs, which has never been done before, because you've needed, like, field spell plus a monster, or you've needed 2 monsters. Like, you've always needed something like that, but now it actually has 1-card combos that are on the horizon. Nice for that deck. This is rank 10 trains. I'll put this right next to Machina, because that's probably where it is. It's in a similar area to that deck. As of right now, it's decent, but nothing too crazy. This is pure Therions. I wouldn't recommend playing pure Therions. It's terrible as a pure deck, but as a kind of, like, mixed archetype with other things, like, yeah, with other decks, it's quite good. Any place you can drop a Therion King Regulus, it's actually quite good, but on its own, it's not good enough. Slifer, I think, is consider building something else. It's just not good enough. Slifer is really unsearchable, with the exception of the Jack monsters, but the Jack monsters are just kind of, like, okay. They have a decent resource loop, but generally they're just kind of decent. Next, we've got, this is Punks. Punks are cool. I think Punks are probably maybe tier 3, I think, would be a fair place to put them. You could put them in Rogue too, but I think tier 3 is probably a fair place to put them. They're one of the better synchro decks in the game, but when you compare them to, like, Centurion, or I think they can compete with stuff like Sword Soul, but I think when you compare them to, like, Centurion is better. I think at this point Resonators might really be actually better than them, but I think it's definitely it's probably in the top 5 of synchro decks in the game right now. I think I'm pretty comfortable saying that. Sprites is one of the best Xseed decks in the game. Xseeds are not in a great spot right now. If you look at the top, it's like Link, Fusion, Synchro, Fusion, Link, Trap, not even anything, Fusion, Link, and then, like, yeah, Link, sometimes Xseed, nothing, and then finally we have an Xseed deck. And I think Sprites is definitely somewhere up in tier 3, but it is, by modern standards, a little underwhelming. Sprite most of the time will be a 2-card combo, so you need like Sprite Starter plus a Sprite in hand. You need like a level 2 plus a Sprite in hand. It's usually like a 2-card combo. You have some 1-card combos, but generally speaking, you will usually need, you know, some kind of level 2 plus a Sprite, and then you can go full combo. So it's just being a 2-card combo versus a 1-card combo will hinder you to some degree. Dark Magician is, I'd say it's probably somewhere in Rogue. Is it better than Blue Eyes? It's not better than Blue Eyes. It's like the debate of the century. I don't know. It doesn't really matter because neither of them are better than Snake Eye. So we're having arguments over nothing. And realistically, the deck is just very underwhelming. It does have some cool matchup things that it can do with like Yubel, where it can like banish things so you don't have to destroy them. You can banish their cards with like Dark Magical Circle, stuff like that. Like, it has some cool matchups that it can do. But generally speaking, I think the deck is not in a great place right now. And it definitely needs a wave of support. Next is Elemental Lords. I'm sorry, I mean Earthbound Immortals. Next is Earthbound Immortals. I think Earthbound Immortals are probably somewhere in like Rogue. They're not good enough. You can use some of them as an engine in Resonators, and I think that's a perfectly fine place to play them. I don't think that you have to play them pure. I think they're underwhelming pure. They do have the fusion and stuff like that, but generally speaking, I think the best place to play them is probably in Resonators. It's a much better deck to play them. I accidentally put this twice, so I'm just going to leave it at the bottom. It shouldn't be there twice. This deck is literally unplayable. There's one copy of this, and it takes 20 turns. You can't do it. This is, of course, Final Countdown. You shouldn't play that. Grand Mod, you can always steal games just because it's a billion attack, and you know, you can play the Floodgate version, which I would recommend is probably the best version of the deck. I think it's somewhere on Rogue. Winged Dragon of Ra is the best of the God cards, not because it's the best, but because it has the most support. So I'd say Rogue is probably the fairest place to put it. It's a decent Rogue deck. It has cool like Aqua support that lets you summon those like slime, and then you tribute the slime and you get this like giant monster. It's cool, and I think it's serviceable, but it's not quite good enough. Next, we've got Gem Knights is a decent like fusion deck. It used to be able to FTK. It's less consistent now. It's probably somewhere at the bottom half of Rogue. Not a deck you will almost ever run into. This is considered building something else. Unfortunately, with instant fusion gone, it's just very difficult to really play this deck. This is the Relinquish deck. It's another deck that just needs support. The entire archetype is like 7 cards. Like, that's just not enough. Even if you play 3 of every card, and remember there's extra deck cards too. Even if you play 3 of every card in the archetype, it's only 21 cards, and half of those are from the extra deck. So you have to keep in mind, it's like how many cards are the entire archetype? The entire archetype is literally like maybe like 12 copies of a main deck card, and then the rest of it is like 9 extra deck cards. Like, it's just not enough. It's simply not enough. It needs more support. Next, we've got Witchcrafters. This is an underwhelming spellcaster deck. I would say it's just the end board on this deck is very underwhelming. The draw power and the advantage on this deck is phenomenal, but like what it can actually produce for you to use is not good enough, unfortunately. I think it's in Rogue. Sylvans or Sun Avalon, not Sylvan, Sun Avalon. I would say, again, I think you mix Sun Avalons together with, I put it in the wrong spot. I think you mix, we'll call this Plant Link. Plant Link Sun Avalon, I think, is probably like a tier 3 deck. I think you mix it with the Aromatherapy support, the Romage support, and you mix it with the Sylvan support and all of the other generic plants like Rika and stuff like that, and I think you create a Sun Avalon deck that is probably tier 3. It's quite good. Next is this guy's a warrior. This is Ancient Warriors. Ancient Warriors is insane in every single festival. Every festival. It's been unlocked in the last like 30 festivals, I swear to you. Very good deck for festivals, not so great deck for actual ladder. It's not quite good enough. Yeah, it's just not good enough. I don't think it's strong enough. This deck is definitely unplayable now. This is the Ishizu cards. You cannot play them pure. There's like 2 of them left. I don't think you can even use them at this point. For the most part, they're either banned, gone in some way. I'd say you just play them in Tearlaments and don't play them otherwise. Next, we've got Golem, Earth Golem. I think this is a decent Cyberse engine that you can use to beef up other Cyberse decks like Salamangrates, but as a pure deck, it's probably somewhere around Rogue. I don't think it's good enough. Suships is another deck. I think this is it's a festival warrior. Like, it's unlocked in every last festival. It was legal. The one before that it was legal. The one before that it was legal. It's legal in the last 10 festivals, but I think in the regular game, I don't think it's good enough. I think it's great to have for festivals, but just in the ladder, you're going to struggle against Snake Eye and stuff like that. Crawlers is a decent deck. I'd say consider building something else, and what I'll tell you to build is the pile, the insect pile. I recommend you play the insect pile instead. It's just better, and even that right now is having trouble being good enough. I think it has a cool playstyle, but I don't think it's good enough to beat anybody. Skull Servants, it's different enough from Zombie Pile where I wouldn't say consider building something else, but I'd say it's probably at the bottom of Rogue. It's very one-dimensional. You go second, and you fill up your graveyard, and you try to summon with the giant zombie dude, the King of the Skull Servant. Honestly, not good enough most of the time. Marika is a good deck, I'd say. Both in the plant pile and isolated outside of it, it's still a good deck. I'd say it's probably like tier 3. It could be argued that it's Rogue. It's one of the better budget decks in the entire game, just because you don't need a lot of URs to make this a playable, serviceable deck. It's a better Layer of Darkness. I'd say it's probably somewhere around tier 3. Next is Gaia. This is one of the structure decks, but unfortunately, it's just not good enough. It's a going second deck that does not produce enough advantage to actually allow you to win the game most of the time. Even if you play equalizers, you can't play evenly matched, which is the best going second board breaker there is. You have to play things like Lightning Storm and Raigeki and stuff like that, which unfortunately a lot of modern archetypes float and have a ton of recursion anyway. So like a matchup like Yubel is just a nightmare for this deck. Like, it's so difficult to beat, because even if you Raigeki their front row, you Raigeki their monsters, it's simply not good enough because they all float anyway, and then you attack them and you actually end up losing. It's just not, it's a very bad time to play it. Same thing with Numerons. Numerons, has probably never been a time worse than right now to play Numerons. Yubel is literally like an auto loss if you get matched up with it, and most people are playing Yubel right now. If you go, it doesn't matter where you are on the ladder, you're playing against Yubel. This is like an auto loss against Yubel. Next we've got Final Countdown, not good enough. I'd say it's probably avoid at all costs. Most of the alternate win conditions in the game suck outside of like milling your opponent with Runic. Most other ones just are not good enough right now unless they get support. This is Synchron's. I think Synchron's Rogue. I think the better 5Ds deck right now, honestly, is Resonators. This deck is good, and it did just get... They did take out some more of the Water Enchantress and stuff like that. They took some of those off the ban list, which makes the deck even better, which is nice. The Synchron is one of the best cards that they have. And they did get, like, Wheeler, for example, the Jet Wheeler, which is a good card because it counts as a tuner and a non-tuner, so it gives you a little more versatility. I'd say it's probably somewhere around Rogue. Next, we've got Amazonas. Amazonas is like a decent Rogue deck. I think it's a fun deck, but honestly, it's just not good enough. You need multiple Floodgates to stay playable, so you need like 3 Gozens, 3 Rivalry, which is not good enough because you don't have them anymore. You have 1 Rivalry, 1 Gozen. What are the chances you draw them? Very low. It's a very classic like battle phase beatdown deck, which translated into modern Yu-Gi-Oh! Not good enough to beat most of the modern decks. This is more of an engine than a deck. This is Vernus-Loof. Usually you don't play it pure because it doesn't produce enough advantage in pure, but you can play it in things like, for example, you can play this actually in like Earth Machines if you really wanted to. The best home for this deck is in Madolche, but you can also play it in like Amazonas. But I think it's somewhere to avoid at all costs as a pure deck. Tearlament is a good deck right now, like really good. I'd say it's probably somewhere in tier 2. I think it's actually come back up. It got hit so badly it was unplayable. With some of the new support cards that have dropped, it's probably in like tier 2 now. It's tier 2, maybe tier 3. It's somewhere up here in like the top 10 of the decks in the game right now. It's just very good. It's the best mill deck that we've got right now. You can mix it with Horus. You can mix it with a number of different decks to make it quite good. I'd say it's probably somewhere up there. Next is Kaijus. Don't play pure Kaijus. I'd say it's avoid at all costs just because it's very difficult to actually build a deck with just pure Kaijus. Next is Sacred Beast. Sacred Beast, every single time somebody summons a Dark Beckoning Beast, you hope it's Sacred Beast, but it ends up being Yubel. Sacred Beast is a good deck. It's one of those decks, again, it's just very reliant on going first. Going second with this deck can be very troublesome. Just 'cause going first is like great. You could set up a lot of interruptions. You can draw cards. You can do a lot. Going second, Dark Beckoning Beast is very easy to interrupt as a card, and you don't have the same kind of follow-up that you have in Yubel in this deck. You need your Dark Beckoning Beast to resolve. If it doesn't, you kind of just lose. It's why I think the deck is such a low rarity deck, generally speaking. Next is... this is Generators. I think Generators is like a rogue deck. I think it's okay. It has a lot of bad matchups, and it's one of those decks where if it goes first, you probably are winning. Like if it goes first, you can definitely win that duel. Going second can be a little difficult to do. You're also, you know, it just has great, it has great interruptions when it puts the tokens on the board, and then it can build off of that advantage. You can also hand loop your opponent, which is kind of cool. I just actually learned that. Yeah, I think it's somewhere around Rogue. Next is Dark World. They just lost Ido, which was the lock for Dark World if you wanted to play that. I think Dark World is a resilient deck, and it's probably somewhere around middle to top of Rogue. I think it's a decent deck. It's got it finally got that search card that it needed, and honestly, even with that search card, it's probably still not good enough, just because it's a very luck-based deck. It's a non-linear plus it's luck-based. Non-linear plus luck-based, which is very tough to compete when you're competing with things like Snake Eye, which is like a guaranteed one-card combo. This is like you reveal a danger and you don't know what's going to happen. You don't know what you're going to draw. You don't even if you don't play the dangers, you still don't know what's going to happen, because it's like you draw off of Brow, and it's like no matter what, you always have that, like, you don't know what's going to happen. And I don't think this deck is as good to mix with Unchained as other Fiend decks is, but you definitely can mix it with Unchained. I'd say it is a fair placement for it, Rogue. Next is Gouki. It's another Synchro deck. I'd say it's a top 10 Synchro deck in the game. It's probably somewhere around here. It's getting more support, definitely coming out later on, so I'd say Rogue is probably like a fair place to put it. I think Konami has realized that they want to make more support with water, so there is going to be a year of water where I think this deck will actually move up and become even better. The dragons, the elemental dragons, I'd say are probably, you can build like the rank 7 dragon deck, but even that is honestly not good enough anymore. Like when he goes first, it's good, but when you go second, it's just like you can't really set up much. Some Orgs, honestly, are consider building something else. They're just a worse Fluundereeze in a lot of ways. They're a cool deck, but it was like a beta test for Fluundereeze, if we're being honest. They almost do a lot of the same things. You can even use some of these cards interchangeably with Fluundereeze. Next, Evil Eye. I think this is a cool deck. I think it's kind of a little one-dimensional. I think it's definitely a Rogue deck. It's basically you equip the Selene with equip cards, and every single turn you gain attack, and it makes it so you can't destroy her, can't target her. You have to get rid of the spell or trap card. That's all fine, but there's just very easy ways to deal with that now. There's a lot of non-targeting, non-destruction removal that can just get rid of her, so it's not as much of a stressful situation as it was in like 2018 dealing with this card. Next is Melfi. Melfi's probably one of the best XC decks in the game, I'd say, especially with all the things coming off the ban list. I think it's somewhere up here. It's one of the better XC decks in the game. I think it's better than Exo Sister. It is probably the best XC deck in the game right now, which is why it was so overrepresented in the festival. I'd say it's probably somewhere around tier 3. The new meta has actually like made me kind of miss Melfi. Not Melfi, it's made me actually kind of miss Pearly. Pearly's like, it can be very broken at times because the monster's unaffected, its boss monster's unaffected, and its shuffle sticks to the bottom of the deck. But at the same time, it is overall a lot more fair than a lot of the tier 1 decks that are up here. Mekanko is another deck that has a very weird matchup with, I'd say it's probably in tier 3 as long as you don't play against Yubel. It has a weird matchup against Yubel because they both kind of have similar effects where your opponent takes the battle damage. You're two 0 attack monsters, so it's a little bit of a weird matchup where neither player can really get anything done. And if they have Nightmare Pain, you can't even attack into the Kaiju you give your opponent. You have to like attack into their Yubel monsters, which have 0 attack. So it's a little bit of a weird matchup. So I'd say it's probably somewhere around tier 3. Kashtira is another deck that's probably like it's a top 10. It's a probably top 3 XC deck. I'd say it's probably somewhere in tier 3. It sustained so many hits that it's actually quite difficult to win with this deck anymore. Not to win. It's easy to win with this deck, but it's not as consistent as it used to be. This deck used to be a lot more consistent. It's gotten so many hits at this point that it's like Fenrir's at 1 and Unicorn's at 2 and the Field Spell is at 1. Like, there's so many hits to this deck that the consistency of the deck is just so much lower. But this deck has such a great matchup with Rogue decks that it doesn't really matter. It still cooks Rogue decks. Plus, it has Arise Heart, which Arise Heart, if you go first, Arise Heart Pass is in a lot of cases, unless they draw Imperm. Kind of good enough to beat most decks. Next is Rescue Ace. I think Rescue Ace is cool. I think it's somewhere Rescue Ace mixed with, like, I think it's probably like tier 3. Rescue Ace Fire King, Rescue Ace Snake Eye, still a very strong deck. Still a very powerful deck, probably around tier 3. It benefits from having both. Rescue Ace has an insane advantage loop. Like, you can literally set like 4 or 5 cards in one turn. It's like, it's crazy that you can do that, and they all maybe are not the best effects, the cards that you set, but you're still setting 4 cards. You're going +4. It's still really good. Next, we've got Ninjas, which is also a structure deck. I think it's somewhere in Rogue. This deck shined when we had Kashtira format, because it could like book things without needing to use the graveyard, which was nice for the deck at that time, but against the modern decks, it's just not really good enough. Next, we've got Gishki. This is another deck. You can mix it with sprites and then play sprites with a few Gishki sprinkled in. That deck is actually quite good. I think it's somewhere around Rogue. But honestly, I think that sprites on their own are probably better. I mean, sprites usually are going to be mixed. If you're going to mix sprites, it's debatable who you should be mixing the sprites with. I'd say it's probably at the higher end of Rogue if you're playing it pure. If you're playing with sprites, you can make an argument it's a tier 3 deck. So I'd say it's probably somewhere around there. Prediction Prince is just not good enough. It's like a ritual deck that, again, is just really, really fair. And having fair decks in the modern game, it's just not good enough anymore. This is Fossil Dyna and Friends. Basically, this is Stun. Stun is actually quite good right now, like really good right now, because Stun is actually really good against the meta decks. It's good against Yubel. It's good against Fire King Snake Eye. It's good against most of these decks. If you summon a Fossil Dyne, equip it with a Moon Mirror Shield, and have a Solemn Judgment face down, most of the time you will be winning that duel against pretty much the majority of decks here. So it's actually quite a good deck. I'd say it's probably somewhere around, because it can be a little inconsistent sometimes. I'd say it's somewhere around tier 3. It has a natural advantage in Master Duel, just because people can't side deck around stuff, so they're kind of stuck with what they're playing, so they may not have the back row hate needed to actually beat you. So I'd say tier 3 is fair. Next is Manadium, one of the better synchro decks in the game. I'd say Manadium is probably around somewhere around tier 3. It's one of the better synchro decks in the game. I'd say it's probably somewhere up here. I think it's better than Sword Soul. I think it's better than Resonators. I think it's one of the better synchro decks in the game for sure. So I'd say it's probably up here in tier 3. Unfortunately, synchros, I don't think it's better than Centurion at this point, but it is better than some of these other decks. Like I said, it's a very good deck. It's a very strong deck. I don't think it does quite as much as Centurion, but it does different things, so you don't have to worry about doing the same thing as Centurion. It is still very good at making level 10s, and Barone is still legal in Master Duel, whereas it's banned in the TCG, so that will definitely beef up that deck. Gate Guardian, I think, is a rogue deck. I think the biggest problem with this deck is not the end boards. I think the biggest problem with this deck is that it can be a little bricky, because you have to play bricks as a part of your natural deck, and on top of having to play bricks, just generally, it's just a bricky. You have a lot of monsters that are just very high level. So that in itself will create bricky situations. And I think it isn't Rogue for that reason. This is VS. I think this Vanquished Soul is probably tier 3. I think it's a decent deck. Maybe not the best deck right now, but it's definitely a very good deck. And it can still play D-Shifter, Ash, Maxi, all that stuff. And it can combo off of having those cards. Isn't that crazy? You combo off of having hand traps without even having to use the hand traps to combo off of. See, like, you could combo off of hand traps in, like, for example, sprites. Like, you could summon a Maxi if you bricked and combo off with that. You can combo off of hand traps with Synchrons, for example. You can summon Jet Synchron and then summon back a Maxi. This deck, you can combo off with hand traps without even having to commit to them. You just reveal them from hand. It's actually really good. That's next is Burger. The Hungry Burger deck is probably in Rogue. It's one of the better ritual decks in the game, which isn't really saying much, because rituals are, as a mechanic, kind of inherently not that great. The problem with the Hungry Burger Novella deck, despite being able to completely cheat ritual summons, you tribute your opponent's monsters, which is like insane to me. Despite that being a very good mechanic for you, it kind of is a deck that kind of needs to go first. Going second is a little bit more troublesome. Going first is a little easier, because you can interrupt by ritual summoning, so you get to interrupt and you get to ritual summon, which is kind of cool. But going second can be a little troublesome for this deck. Next, we've got Nilmaria. Nilmaria is okay. I think it's a decent, like, cool rogue OTK deck. I don't think it's quite good enough, but it definitely has some cool things that you can do. It's more of like one of those archetypes that's supposed to be kind of like a budget archetype, but because it's Master Duel, every deck has to have UR, so it ends up being not a budget archetype. Next we've got Gold Pride. I think Gold Pride is like kind of in the higher end of Rogue. I don't think it's like super good because it requires it's a deck that requires you to have lower life points, so you have to like drop your life points, be at a disadvantage, then you can combo off and do additional effects. But you can do that with stuff like Garbage Lord and cards like that. You can pay life points, so I think it's a decent deck, but I don't think it has trouble competing with some of the higher end decks here. But I think Tier Rogue is probably fair for us. Scare Claw, not Scare Claw. This is Super Heavy Samurai, Scarecrow, but it's Super Heavy Samurai. I think this is like a tier 3 deck. It's one of the better, again, synchro decks in the game, probably a top 5 synchro deck. They hit this deck quite quickly, whereas other decks they haven't really hit at all, but this deck they just instantly like hit, and it has gotten hurt by getting hit so quickly. Honestly, I think the deck overall is still quite strong, especially if you go first, you set things up. It's very difficult to play through. Again, it's one of those decks that going second can be a little bit troublesome, especially if you're playing against Snake Eye, because they have so much recursion they can play on your turn. Same thing with Yubel, it can be a little bit of a problem, but I think going first with this deck is still quite strong. And that is it. That is the entire tier list. It is everything available here. This is the entire tier list. Thank you for watching, and have a great day. La, 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 la.